Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. I normally would be doing a blog today instead of a live stream, but I have some new graphs, and so I'm going to show those off today. I also think that for those who look at my blog and my live stream, it may be nice to see me demo the graphs on the live stream first before you go to gregfarrar.us and look at them yourself. So let's jump right into it. We'll start with the countries, then we'll do the states of the United States, and then the counties of California. So, let's see if I can get a slightly better angle where I don't have as much glare on the screen. I'll probably make my background look terrible. I'm basically in a basement here, but at least I'll be able to see. There, something like that. So the total cases, as always, the United States in the lead, and really doesn't show signs of slowing down at this point. The United States is still rising. It's above its trend line. It's accelerating. Brazil in second place is looking better than that. It at least is following its own trend line. It's not probably therefore accelerating much, but it is still rising. More about the same number of cases every day. This probably means to have the dots right on the trend line, followed by India and Russia. If we look in daily cases per million by country, we see that, wow, there's some crazy dot up here in Chile that probably isn't real. I'm just going to zoom in to get rid of that. Qatar, which has been our news for a long time as the worst hit country in the world, is certainly no longer that. It's recovering better than just about anyone. I mean, it's trending downward more than the other top countries in daily cases per million. It's no longer hot. It is still warm, but it's going down so quickly. 144. It's not long till it hits 100, and after that it will be no longer even a warm spot. Similarly, Chile is, let's just zoom in on Chile specifically, 116 and dropping. Chile was also a hot spot, no longer. Chile is, in fact, has its most, 2 days ago it had a day that was not even warm, not even 100. So Chile, part of that, a major part of the Central South America cluster, is well on its way to recovery. Looking at Brazil, however, not so obvious that it is on its way to recovery. It still seems to be rising. Pretty clear from this graph that it's probably not accelerating much. It may just be holding steady, or if the trend line says it's rising, but it may be that it actually has reached a plateau and the trend line just hasn't realized it. The United States, as we've seen, continues to, it had a particularly bad day just now, a new record. And so the United States continues to rise. Not accelerating perhaps, but we'll see that in the graphs to come. It is certainly still rising, certainly not getting better, at least at the level of daily cases in the United States right now. As usual, we have Bahrain, which used to be Qatar's best buddy, is definitely not following the same trajectory anymore. Bahrain is leveled out at just poking in there just above 100. The United States is a daily cases hotspot. Okay, so new graph. This is really just the daily cases graph. But I've got these dark background graphs with lots of colors on them and dotted lines and so on. I started doing this a week or so ago with the graph that shows the trajectories from when they hit 100 daily cases per million, the trajectories of all the countries, states, and counties. I've changed the background so it's easier to see the colors. And in theory, the colors the lines can actually be distinguished from each other. This uses 24 reasonably distinctive colors, and then once it runs out of that, it switches over to dots and then dashes. And I actually don't know what happens when it gets, I guess it never runs out of that. Dots, dashes, dot dashes. Actually, I think it does repeat eventually. So not quite when we do all the countries. We can't quite cope, but it does work for the states. In any case, as always, you can point to it in the dynamic version to see what's what. And you can turn things on and off with the legend if you're using the dynamic, the website version, which is what I'm using when I do this live stream. So you can see Qatar. This also goes back considerably further than we typically have in these graphs. I think by getting rid of the dots, my graphing software is able to actually handle the graphing of these lines better, which is why part of why I was getting rid of the old stuff, where I was only showing a 6-week to 8-week window on many of these graphs, the most recent 6 to 8 weeks. But that isn't necessary, and it's always been kind of annoying that something like Spain, or Italy, that we couldn't see the history of them, because this graph is great in showing us something that I've only realized a few weeks ago, and have only just recently been alluding to, therefore, which is that for all the noise about Italy, it was never even warm. You can see Italy's peak here, the dotted yellow. Italy, let's look at Italy. We have essentially the whole history of Italy here, for the pandemic anyway. And Italy, at the time, seemed like a terrible problem. It was world news. Got over it, stayed low, and now it's at 3 daily cases per million. Remember, this is possible to get down to 3 and stay there. We don't see that a lot in the United States right now. But Italy never even hit 90 in its 14-day rolling average. And so all this stuff that's happened since just makes Italy kind of a very small problem. I mean, you look at Qatar, which is almost 10 times, Qatar peaking at around 700, but even beyond that, let's see, Oman and Panama we've already seen in other graphs. This is really just another daily cases per million graph like the one we saw above, but it shows the history. Oh, and I guess the important thing I may not have mentioned here is these dark background graphs do not use the same trend line approach. The trend line approach that I've been using for this one, for instance, uses a trend line called LOWESS, L-O-W-E-S-S, which gives these very broad sweeps of what the general trend is, which is good. It's good to just get a sense. These ones give a much more detailed trend. You can see not every little wiggle, because I flattened these out a lot by averaging 14 days for every point. But there's still a lot of wiggle. I mean, look at Bahrain here. It's, in spite of being a 14-day moving average, it is fluctuating wildly. But anyway, we see there was Europe. There was Europe getting it and getting over it. Here's a little bit more of probably Europe. Yep, Ireland getting it and getting over it. Singapore getting it and getting over it. Mostly. Singapore, I think, is a little bit iffy. Let's see, Singapore. No, actually, Singapore is okay. It did get warm, and then it mostly got better. It's at 40. But remember, Spain is at 3. So you can do better than Singapore, and 40 is not that great, but it's not a warm spot, even. But you see the world has some serious continuing problems. Really, Qatar is still a problem, even though it's very clearly and strongly recovering. Bahrain is flat but recovering. And what is this? Chile also seems to be recovering. But we have at least 2 major problems, which is Oman and Panama. Hard to read. Panama. And those are the hot spots. Only 4 hot spots in the world right now. But Oman and Panama are the ones that look worse. They're rising still. The other 2 hot spots are at least flat in the case of Qatar. They are rapidly dropping. And then there's a whole cluster of warm spots here, which I'll just look at briefly. Warm spots are South Africa, which is really looking bad right now. It's not quite hot, but it'll be there real soon at this rate. United States is the, sure I got this right, yeah. It's the dotted line, also looking just about as bad as South Africa. Rising quickly, no signs of slowing right now. Kuwait is looking okay. If you look at Kuwait alone, the dashed dot green, it seems to be showing a sustained trend since the beginning of July of slightly downward, or at least flat. And Armenia looking better, pretty wiggly but looking better. And then Chile, as we've seen, looking much better. Another one that's not looking better is Israel, a warm spot, sharply rising. Bolivia, slightly rising. And Peru, the broad scope of Peru, as it starts way over here and drops. So we have a very short-term rise, but it's nothing to necessarily believe is the start of a new trend. Peru looking pretty good. And on the whole, Central South America looking pretty good. I could do all sorts of stuff in this graph. I'm tempted to look into Central South America, but not going to right now because I got a lot to do today with these new reports, new graphs. The trajectories graph really is going to look a lot like this graph. It should anyway. Like here you see Oman or Qatar doing its rise and fall, exactly the same shape. Qatar doing its rise and fall. They're just all offset so that, first of all, it only shows countries that have hit 100 DCPM, and it then moves their 100 all to the same place. So we can see the rise and fall since that moment and compare what's a typical trajectory in days for a country. And we see a lot of pretty good news on this graph. There's not a lot of really bad news on this graph. We see this one, this kind of bad news, Oman, as we've noted. Brazil, flat. Brazil not so great. Where was the other one? There was another problem spot here. It was, yeah, Panama. What's Panama doing on this graph? Okay, that's Panama. Yeah, so Panama and Oman are also visibly the only problems on this graph. But let's go to the funnest graph of all. I'll just briefly show you this one. Actually, this one and this one. That one's really crazy, but I pared that one down to show the growth rates. This is sort of a version of the rope chart, but it's using moving averages. So again, it fluctuates a lot more, and it's good for seeing short-term what's happening with the country and kind of to get a sense of which countries really had problems. Briefly, for Ethiopia, for instance, 200% almost growth week over week. This is in growth over weeks. One of the things that I'm trying to do with this graph is what it does is it takes the growth for the past week, and then it takes the total daily cases for the or DCPM for the past week, and then it takes the DCPM for the previous week, and it compares them. And by working at the week on the week level, that eliminates this sine wave we typically see of weekends being down, I think, and weekdays being up, and weekends down, weekdays up, which can very easily start to give us a false sense that something is recovering if suddenly, but it seems like it's happening every week. It's recovering and then it's getting worse, and recovering, getting worse. So one of the things I was trying to do is eliminate that wiggle from the graph by only dealing with a week at a time. This does mean that it moves fairly slowly. We're certainly you're not going to get any trends at the day level. We won't know if the day that a trend starts, but we will know a week or two after a trend starts. So I'm not going to spend much time on this graph because I actually have a better one. When I look at this graph, like to give an example of why I have a better one, I'm including this just kind of for reference. If you look at Japan, Japan right now has it has the worst actually growth. Japan is seeing 100% growth. But let's see, do I have a way to see daily cases per million for anything? I do, right? This is daily cases per million. So let's look at Japan. I think we're going to find that Japan is not in serious trouble. Come on, Japan, what you doing? Yeah, Daily cases per million for Japan. This is just classic. This is the classic problem with the rope chart and the growth thing. Japan had less than a half daily cases per million. Recall that 100 is required to make it a warm spot. Now suddenly it has 2 daily cases per million. So that seems like a fourfold increase, and it is in cases, but it has so few cases that this is not something to be alarmed by. It could be the very beginning of an epidemic, but it has a lot of runway before there's a problem here. So this is the problem with the growth chart, is it takes little bitty ones, and this is why in my traditional growth rope chart, I've only shown the hottest ones, so that we at least know that it's only looking at the daily cases per million hottest. But the way that I've tried to do it, I'll just go straight to the new chart. So anyway, Japan looks terrible, but really isn't. Japan is doing great. It just has a very fast growth right now from a very low place. And there, by the way, if you ever want to know, there are the growths of any particular country. But again, you'll see crazy stuff like 400% growth for Mongolia. But I'm guessing if we look at Mongolia, let's just do it just to get one more example of this. If we actually look at Mongolia, I haven't heard about Mongolia being a problem. I don't think Mongolia is a problem. I think we're going to find that its daily cases per million are just fine. And there's Mongolia at 1 daily case per million. These are just noise. They are all very much not hard hit yet. So sure, it may be headed to be the next hot spot, but with only 1 daily case, you get all these wild fluctuations when you have so few cases. Where if you had 1 case yesterday and you have 5 cases today, it looks like a 500% growth. And it is, but that doesn't mean it matters. So I have a new graph, severity. My severity graph is an attempt on a single graph to do both of the things that I've been doing typically on 2 graphs. One of them is the daily cases per million. How bad is this in terms of daily cases per million? But then we're multiplying it by a factor which is based on its growth rate. So for instance, if you have daily cases per million of 100, you're a warm spot. And if you're flat, your growth rate is 1, no change, then you get a rating of 100 on this scale. But if your daily cases per million is 100, so your DCPM warm spot, but you have a doubling every week, this is actually weekly doubling every week, then that ends up being a 200. 100 DCPM times the growth factor. And as far as I can tell, this does a pretty good job. When I look at these, I say, yeah, these are the countries that we really think are the worst right now. But this takes out things like Mongolia or Japan, because they have really low DCPMs. And it also takes out countries like New York. Let's see, no. What does it take out? What it would take out, I'm not sure if we have any examples of this. A country that has a very high daily cases per million, but is shrinking very quickly. We would consider that country not to be severely hit right now. Even though it has a lot of cases, if it's shrinking really fast, it would not appear in the top of this graph. So look at who's actually the worst in severity. Bahrain. Hello, Bahrain. We know you very well. Bahrain actually outweighing Qatar. Qatar is still fairly serious because though it's dropping, and for instance, just to give a comparison here, if you look at the daily cases per million graph, just the straight up DCPM, well, this isn't doing quite what I thought it would. Qatar is showing 200, but here it's also showing 200. No, it's a little under 200. So Qatar is shrinking, and because it's shrinking, then it's been pushed under the 200 mark. I'm not sure that I'm giving enough weight to growth. So this algorithm here may change as well. I would think that Qatar with an angle like that would be a lot below 200, but maybe I need to multiply the growth by 7 or something to change it into a daily growth rate. In any case, this does at least not include things like Mongolia. So the Bahrain is worst, Oman, and for now I'm just going to use the 100 and 200 as well to call it severity. hot spots and severity warm spots. We've got Israel and the United States, South Africa, Panama, Oman, and Bahrain as our hot spots right now in severity. Also fairly severe Qatar, Brazil, though dropping. You can see that green line just dropping a little bit. Kuwait, and then a few others. Romania. There are quite a lot of others that are warm as well worldwide. All right, anything else I need to do here? So this graph can be useful if you want to know what Burkina Faso, don't know how to pronounce that one, how it's doing. Well, it's doing all right. It's around, it had a really big spike a little bit ago, but now it's slightly shrinking. You can pick out any old country you like, and very broadly you can see these are centered around 0. There is a tendency to go high rather than low. As a particular, I think typically if we looked deeply at one of these spikes, we would find it was a particular small country, Trinidad and something in this case, that suddenly got its first case, and then it got its second case, and then suddenly it had 10 cases, and that gave it a spike up into the high hundreds. But mostly the countries live here around the bottom. And this graph is kind of worthless when it's just like that. Completely worthless, I'd even say. But it can be handy if you wanted to say, pick out all the Latin American countries. And I'm not going to spend the time doing that, but it's worth looking at Brazil, though. For instance, we called a bottom on Brazil just a little bit ago, and then it seemed like it was getting worse. But Brazil is again looking like it's hitting 0. It's actually showing a negative growth of cases. So Brazil seems to be doing all right. Let's compare it for the moment with the United States. Always interested in the United States. Oops. All right, let's just look at the United States alone. So this is interesting. The United States as a whole, compare this with the rope chart. The rope chart again is super conservative, and it does not quickly decide that something is doing better or worse. So if you look at the rope chart based on these same data points, well, actually the rope chart has finally decided that the United States is doing better. This is news to me. I don't think I've noticed this. I think it's new. In fact, it's just in the past few days, the United States is finally turning downward in its growth rate. It was at 3.2, now it's at 2.9 daily growth. That's still a high growth rate, not an astronomical one, but a high growth rate. But it's dropping just a little bit. But you notice how you could, if you were to draw this line, if you were to take out the line and draw your own line, you might draw one much sharper, starting from, for instance, this point and going down to that point. This point to that point, much sharper downward line. And that's what we see when we look at the United States on this chart. The United States going from a 37% weekly growth rate, the other one is daily, down to and again, that's because we're doing this week at a time thing. I could adjust it to daily, but I think I'll keep it weekly. Weekly, it says right there. From weekly 37% down to a weekly growth rate of 22% in just, what is that? From the July 3rd to July 16th. So in 2 weeks, the United States has recovered to half its weekly growth rate. Now this is feeling like the golden days when I started this live stream, where all the news was terrible about how the United States was going up and up and up. And I did a graph like this, the rope chart it was then, and I said, wait a minute, the United States isn't going up and up and up. Look at that, it's going down. Now it doesn't mean we're not getting more cases every day, but this is an extra level of analysis that says, what's the change in the growth rate? We're growing still 20% new cases, 22% more cases every week than we had the week before. So then the headlines will continue. It says, United States sets a new record. United States sets a new record. But if you look at the growth rate, it is dropping. And if it took 2 weeks to get there, if it keeps going in another couple weeks, it'll be down to 0, and the United States will then start to plateau on the, let me show this. I'm starting to like these charts better. I may just start phasing out my blue ones. But on the, let's see if I can find it here. It's just really not obvious from this that looking at the daily cases per million, it is really not obvious that the United States is bending downward and heading towards plateau. But in about what that other graph says is there's enough of a bend here that it is actually going to, in 2 to 3 weeks, it's going to start. It'll be horizontally flat like it was here. This graph, as you can see, this line looks quite a lot like it's the direction and everything quite a lot like it did back in April and late March, and then it plateaued around April 17th. If the trend continues in growth rates, as we see in our growth chart, that's going to happen here as well around around August 1st to August 5th, maybe. August 1st to August 5th, we'll see another plateau like this. Now that's a while away, and things could change between now and then, but that's what this graph is suggesting for the United States. It's a good graph. Good to see us heading downward finally, because the news has just been bad for months. At least we have a solid bit of good news for the United States. All right, that's a lot of time to spend on the United States. I'm going to go on to the states of the United States and look a little deeper into that. All right, I'm just going to zoom on to the new graphs and see what we see here. This is actually a little wigglier than the other one. I think that I was using well, it says a 14-day average. Okay, so here are all the states. I want to focus on the Gang of Six, as I often do, just to show what they're doing. The Gang of Six were Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. These were the ones that were the worst just 6 weeks ago, or maybe 4 weeks ago. And they were all the news, especially Arizona. Now, if you look here, Arizona is very clearly, has clearly peaked around July 10th, about a week ago, peaked and is dropping. Now, of course, things can change, but that looks pretty good. And around then, and the week before even, I was starting to say, hey, look, Arizona appears to be peaking. It appears to be peaking, and now we can see it on this graph. Now, South Carolina, all of them except for Alabama, actually, also are peaking, though it's not nearly so obvious on this graph. They haven't peaked yet. They're still rising, but they're trending towards a peak. You can see on this one, on South Carolina, the sort of thing that the growth chart is using, which is to say it's sharply upwards, but it seems to be leveling off quite a bit. It's maybe even horizontal as of right now. And so that's the sort of analysis the rope chart or the growth chart does. And so it is with all of these. It's really not obvious in the case of North Carolina, but I believe we'll see when we look at the growth chart that North Carolina also is doing that. So let's look at the growth chart and at the Gang of Six. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. It's much wigglier than the graphs we're used to seeing. I'll show it on the rope chart too. The classic rope chart. Arizona, Alabama, Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. In here, this is the graph that I keep showing. We can see that again, Alabama has abandoned the crowd and is looking bad. It's growing 4% and accelerating. But the other 5 of the Gang of Six are looking pretty good. And in fact, Arizona, which used to be the worst, has taken the sharpest dive and is almost to 0 in its growth rate. It is, according to the rope chart, peaking now. Now we can see from that chart that it really arguably peaked a week ago. But the row chart, again, conservative, takes its time in deciding what things are happening. This is a much faster moving graph that shows us a lot more subtlety to the day-to-day, week-to-week movements. So if we look at, we're kind of going to have to squint on this one. You don't have to squint on Arizona. Arizona is blatantly obvious. It rose sharply. It was up to something like 80% week-over-week growth. That's very high. It's more than, or 10% a day or more. And 40%, I think, is generally, I would call it bad growth weekly. So we got up at almost 80, and then it recovered, fully recovered. It is down to no growth at all right now. And we saw, as we saw on the other one, it really seems to have peaked and actually is dropping. And I think we're gonna see this continue to drop below zero, and Arizona will get over it. This one, South Carolina, doing something similar, peaking at 70, very high, and clearly the yellow dotted or dashed line here heading downward. It's down to only 20% growth, which is, or actually better than that, 15% growth, which is pretty good. It's got to get down to zero before we can really say it's recovering. Here we have Utah, peaked around 45, descending ever since then, almost down to zero. Here we have North Carolina, peaked a little lower and not quite as clear that it's recovering, but it does have a downward trend. The pinkish dotted line here, dashed line, is lower on average than it has been, but slightly higher recently. And then then there's Alabama. Let's see, is Alabama the one that's misbehaving? Yeah, Alabama. It's really hard to say. It's got this sawtooth thing, but generally seems to be, I mean, it recovered for a moment to negative growth and back and up, down. It doesn't know what it's doing, Alabama. But the general trend is slightly upwards. So Alabama not as good as the others. But this is the Gang of Four. They're doing very well. They're solidly recovering. The Gang of Six, solidly recovering, except for Alabama that's flailing a bit. That is, however, about the only good news for the states right now. I mean, the only good news at that level anyway. If you look at all the states, the hottest states together, you see there's just this real upward trend still. The hottest states are still rising. And if we look at all the states, we also see a solid upward trend from back in early May. There are a lot of diagonal upward lines here. So as a whole, states are rising. There are just a few that are shrinking. But we can see these lines, these diagonal lines cross-cutting, and those are I'll say the Gang of Five, really, because Alabama, again, isn't cooperating, but those Gang of Five, which were the first ones to get it bad, have also begun their trajectory towards recovery. Now let's look at some of the other ones. Let's look at Texas, Florida, and California. And let's look at them on this graph that will show us growth rates at a pretty granular level, so we can spot trends pretty early. Texas, you can see right there, that's a good graph. That is what we like to see mostly. California, not quite so good. And what did I say? We'll throw in, oh no, we're not going to do that. Florida, of course. Let's zoom out a bit. Now look at these. These are the ones that were in the news a few weeks ago. No, not a few weeks ago. These are the ones that are in the news now. They started showing up in the news a few weeks ago. And the alarm that are being rung throughout all of Florida, or through the whole nation about Florida, are very loud. Florida at capacity, hospitals at capacity, overflowing, Texas as well. There's this real sense that Florida and Texas are going to hell. And California, not so much. California, fortunately, I guess, has never really gotten this as badly as other states. But it shows a little bit of the same trend. But look at Florida. Florida really did have it bad. Again, 40%, it's in past tense, did have it bad. 40% weekly growth is bad. and it got up to 80, and it just stayed there after week after week. 3 weeks it stayed at 80% daily growth. That is alarming, and that's what gets you into a place like where they actually are in the daily cases per million, where let's just show all the, no, I don't want the since 100 version. I want the total, the graphs over time. Florida, congratulations, you are the worst state. Florida has reached 500 daily cases per million. How do you do that? Well, you start off warm, or slightly warm, and you do 3 weeks of 80% growth. By the way, yeah, there's that. Arizona again. Arizona has dropped away a little, and now Florida wins. So, looking at this graph, you would think Florida was headed for a very bad place. But the reality is Florida is in a very bad place, but it's headed for a good place. And this is just a great graph for Florida. They 2 weeks ago they were at 80. The growth rate was 80% every week of new cases, and then a week ago they were down to 45, and now Florida is at 25. They're not even at 40 there, which is what I sort of the place that I guess I'd call that a growth hotspot in this sense or something. 40 is bad for sure. 25 is not great, but it's been trending sharply downward. So Florida is looking very good. Similarly, Texas, which you hear a lot about hospital capacity and so on. Well, the hospitals probably aren't going to have to worry so much anymore. They will some, because we are still seeing 20% weekly growth. So next week there will be 20% more cases, and the hospitals will need to have some more capacity. But Texas is heading downward. In the case of Florida, it's reasonable that they will peak in a week. And at that point, if their hospitals are still okay, and it seems like they are, because there are all these ICUs, 50 ICUs at capacity. Okay, that's a problem, I guess. But there are also a lot of ICUs that aren't at capacity, so we're gonna what do they call it? Bypass or move people. I can't remember the term you use when the hospital doesn't accept a patient, it moves them to another hospital. Just keep doing that. As long as there are other hospitals in the area that aren't at capacity, then pretty soon we're going to reach a point where it'll be okay, I think. This is really looking good for Florida, looking pretty good for Texas. Texas is down at 20%, and that's not bad. Their growth rate has slowed. It's not quite as sharply downward as it was, but they seem to be headed in a good direction. In California, hard to say. We have a sharp drop in just the past few days from 40% to 20%. It'd be great if that continues, but that's such a short-term wiggle that we can't really rely on it. The broader trend is still mostly upwards or flat for California. Okay, I have hardly gotten to the severity graph, my favorite new graph. I'll just briefly take a look at it. Who has it worst in severity? Again, this counts both the it counts the growth rate and the DCPM, daily cases per million. Who has it worst? Well, Florida does, and Alabama is shortly behind this. Again, I have a sense that this graph is looking a lot more like a DCPM graph than a combination DCPM and growth. So I think I want to weigh the growth more heavily next time. But anyway, this is a little bit stronger here, the difference where Florida has it a little bit worse than Arizona, and or it has compared to this graph where they're pretty close. And on the severity graph, there's a little bit of compensation here where it says, well, okay, but Florida seems to be trending upwards still. It is growing, still growing, growth rate shrinking, but still growing, whereas Arizona is not growing at all. And so it gets a 500, which is right where its DCPM is. Anyway, worst states: Florida, Arizona, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama. There are just still a lot of states that have it pretty bad. Go to gregfarrar.us if you want to see specifically which ones they are. I'm going to spin through that quick if you want to pause the video or something. I do want to take just a look at Louisiana, because Louisiana has been the real exception in this graph, the one that shows the trajectory. It just keeps going. By the way, remember that Delaware was an exception? Not so much anymore. Delaware is showing a trend towards recovery. It's dropping back to 100. But Louisiana rising it's had it as long as anybody. It's just about the longest lived, 105 days of all the states since they hit 100, but it's rising fast, and it's at 400 almost DCPM. So let's just take a quick look at Louisiana. Nothing good there. Let's see what the growth rate of Louisiana is. Might it be peaking? How is the growth rate of Louisiana? Okay, I should say this is weekly percent in the title of this graph. Okay, Louisiana. So here again, this graph starts to show us good news, where Louisiana certainly has had, again, 40 is bad, but Louisiana, I think that I might even say that 20 makes something a hot spot. But Louisiana is, it had this period of sustained growth, and now, at least for the past couple weeks, it's been dropping. Now, we've seen drops like that before. We saw one here, we saw one here. So who knows? Maybe it'll just keep going back up. But at this point, for the short term, Louisiana is looking better, which is good because it's one of the worst in severity. All right, I'm going to zoom on. I'm running out of time here. Zoom on to the counties of California. I have all these same fancy new graphs here. And I'm going to mostly focus on them today. Daily cases per million. And this again goes way back in time, much farther back than we've usually gone. Probably farther back than we really ought to for this graph. I'm just going to chop it off for the moment, at least till there. Give us a little more granularity. So we see, as always, imperial and kings are the real problems, or have been the real problems. Kings slowly recovering, though, it seems, not so much. In the very short term, they're actually shooting upwards. But there's a slow trend towards recovery from kings and from imperial. Ignoring those two, I thought that would auto resize for me. There it did. Ignoring those two, we have, who was that? Santa Barbara had some sort of a weird spike. We have Stanislaus. I don't know what's up with Stanislaus. I'll have to check in. Usually when something like this happens, it turns out there's a prison. And so maybe that's what's happening. Maybe there's a prison outbreak in Stanislaus or something. But whatever it is, Stanislaus suddenly is hot, very hot, 400 DCPM, and very quickly rose to there. It was even back here. I can grab it. It's not going to let me grab it. Got it? Got it? Come on, Stanislaus. I don't know. Anyway, I can see the dotted line. I'll just zoom in on it. So there's this spike from warm spot territory suddenly to blazing hot. So something's happening in Stanislaus. Something is rotten in Stanislaus. Kings there, yeah. Also bad, San Joaquin, interestingly, because the Bay Area, the broader Bay Area is pretty good, but San Joaquin, which is near the Bay Area at least, or maybe you'd even call it one of the Bay Area counties, is really out of control here at 330 daily cases per million. Tulare, Merced, San Bernardino, Orange, Riverside, Los Angeles. Let's look at Los Angeles on this graph. So yeah, Los Angeles just gradually rising. I think that the rope chart's going to show that it's fairly, the growth chart. Let me take a look at Los Angeles here, because Los Angeles is still most of the cases. Yeah, it's all over the place, kind of. But maybe on average, the growth is around 20% per week. That's not terrible. 40% is bad. 20% is a little bad. But it's really not clear. Sometimes it's shrinking, sometimes it's growing. Even with doing this 14-day moving average to try to flatten this thing out, it's just not flattening. It won't show us any particular trend. If we looked at the really broad trend using the traditional rope chart, we see a very slight trend towards growing, 4%, maybe more. My battery's running out. Should probably plug in when I do these things. But I'm almost done anyway. But if I suddenly disappear, my battery probably ran out. So Los Angeles really just still not looking good. What I'm doing, this is where we were in growth, or in total cases per million. I'll pop into San Diego again since I got my special request the other day. I have some new graphs for San Diego. Let's just see how that's looking. Again, if you want to have your own region or your favorite region analyzed here, just let me know. Happy to do a brief detour into any particular region that I cover. Daily cases per million, Los Angeles, a warm spot, middle and warm spot. And yeah, San Diego. In terms of daily cases per million, yeah, same thing. Why are these? No, this is just a difference between having. Oh, those are the daily cases trajectories. Never mind. What is the growth of San Diego? San Diego. Well, this is actually pretty good to see. San Diego's had its bad times, and just recently had some pretty bad times back up in the 71 area just at the beginning of this month, 3 weeks ago. Very steadily, very sharply since then been dropping, and is now down to a mere 9% weekly growth rate. That's a pretty low growth rate, and more importantly, that trajectory suggests that San Diego may be headed towards zero. Though it's been there before, and it didn't hold it, but at least right now San Diego seems to be in a good place and a good trajectory, and not too high in daily cases per million. If we look at the overall trends of states, let's look at the overall rope chart. There's the rope chart. The overall rope chart of all counties is looking about like it always does. Really not very good. We have a lot of counties rising fairly sharply. Some of them. Most counties are still getting more and more cases every day. There are a few bucking that trend. Santa Barbara, Madera, and then several that are actually shrinking. Nevada, Imperial, Marin. If we look at the same thing on this chart, I'm not sure if this is going to be as easy to interpret. Pretty sure it's not. But we can say this is a much wavier chart, and there's not this sense of like who's generally up or down. I think I will keep the old rope chart. This does not replace it. It's good for getting a short-term sense of each one. But one thing this is good for is saying, on the whole, are they above zero or below? And on the whole, they're above zero. There are very few counties right now. Imperial, Humboldt, Ventura. That's pretty much it for the counties that are in the short term are shrinking. So yeah, it's still looking pretty bad for California as a whole. A lot of counties are growing, almost all of them, and yeah, very few are shrinking. The biggest one still is Los Angeles. If Los Angeles can recover itself, and right now it's on a short-term trajectory from, it's just very short-term. Last few days it's been heading downward. So maybe Los Angeles is headed to zero, but we certainly don't have any long-term indication that that's happening. Long-term, it's been hanging out around. Let me just get this to the scale we've been looking at, because it looks like it's kind of low, but really, this is the 40% line. Los Angeles has never really gotten there. Like all of California, it never seems to quite be bad, but it's kind of bad. And so here it is in the 20% range generally, sharply dropping right now, but no real reason to believe that will continue. I know I have some Santa Cruz folks, so let's just take a look. Santa Cruz, the severity graph. I don't think I've shown the severity graph, so before I do Santa Cruz. Noting that the severity of Imperial has dropped below Stanislaus. Stanislaus is actually more severe And again, this is a balance between daily cases per million and growth rates. It is the most severely hit county right now. Imperial is apparently heading downward, looking better. Orange, San Joaquin, Merced, Tulare. These are some of the most severely hit counties other than that. All right, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. So, the counties of California still looking bad, but not super duper bad. They're just universally a little bad, and there's not a whole lot of sense that they're getting better. At the state level, there is more optimism to be found. There are quite a lot of states, including the ones that we hear about on the news, certainly the Gang of Six, but even something like Florida or Texas. Those are showing medium-term improvements in growth rate, suggesting an imminent peak in a matter of a few weeks. So that would be nice if that continues. And then at the country level, we have countries are, as always, are doing, the world as a whole is doing better than the United States. The United States is doing relatively poorly. There are a lot of hot spots in the world, or at least warm spots, but the world as a whole is doing okay, and maybe even showing a little bit of a sense that it might peak and drop away in not too long, a matter of a month or so. So that's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.